War didn't start with a speech. It started before sunrise. Within hours, airstrikes hit Iran, a supreme leader was reported dead, and the Middle East stood on the edge of something far bigger. How did the US-Iran conflict escalate this fast? And what could happen next? In this episode, we break down the latest developments, the history behind them, and the global impact, all in clear, powerful English. If you want to understand world events while improving your English at the same time, subscribe to the English Oasis, because learning English is more powerful when you learn it through real stories. Now, let's begin. Part 1, The Spark That Broke the Sky. What if history didn't announce itself? What if it simply burst into the world before anyone was ready? On the 28th of February 2026, a coordinated military operation between the United States and Israel changed the Middle East forever. This was no ordinary conflict, no simple skirmish. It was the opening strike in a war that would reshape nations and test global alliances. The operation, codenamed Operation Epic Fury by US commanders and Operation Lion's Roar by Israeli forces, struck hundreds of targets across Iran, including air defense sites, missile launchers, and critical command facilities. But the most dramatic outcome was not infrastructure. It was a life, the life of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran. For 37 years, Khamenei had been the central figure in Iran's political and religious system, a man who shaped the direction of the nation and influenced regional politics across decades. For decades, tensions had simmered between Tehran and Washington, rooted in disputes over nuclear ambitions, missile development, and regional influence. Diplomats tried negotiations. Sanctions tightened. Each side accused the other of irreconcilable intentions. But on that late February morning, the simmer turned to explosion. Khamenei was killed in the strikes, confirmed by Iranian state media and later celebrated by US officials as a decisive victory against what they called a destabilizing force. The Iranian government declared 40 days of national mourning, while calling the attack a grave crime against their people and their sovereignty. The world watched in disbelief. A leader of such historical weight gone in an instant. Imagine a generational leader, someone whose image has defined a nation's identity for nearly 40 years, evaporating from the scene of power overnight. That moment did not just kill a man, it shattered assumptions. It raised a critical question. What does the death of a leader mean in a modern age of instant communication, global alliances, and nuclear anxiety? For the United States and Israel, the strike was framed as self-defense, a proactive move against a perceived threat that Iran's missile capability and nuclear potential posed to regional security. For Iran, it was a catastrophic assault and a spiritual wound, and for the rest of the world, it was a sobering moment, a reminder that even the most seemingly stable political systems can unravel in a single strike. But this was only the beginning, because war does not unfold in silence, and neither does its aftermath. In the hours that followed, multiple waves of air and missile strikes echoed across the region. Iran launched counterattacks targeting US military bases and Israeli territory, signaling that the conflict would not end with one blow. And as the skies lit up with defense systems and warnings, the real implications began to emerge, not just militarily, but politically, economically, socially, and globally. This historical encounter, the clash between the United States and Iran, was no longer a theoretical threat discussed in newsrooms and diplomatic chambers. It had become reality, and it was reshaping the world. In the next part, we'll travel back in time to the roots of this conflict to understand why this moment happened and how a story that began decades ago reached this explosive turning point. Part 2, the roots of rivalry, from revolution to retaliation, before missiles crossed the sky in 2026, before leaders made declarations, before the world gasped at the news, there was history. And history, in the case of the United States and Iran, is not short. It stretches back nearly half a century. To understand why this conflict erupted the way it did, we have to travel back to 1979. That year changed everything. In 1979, Iran experienced what is now known as the Islamic Revolution. The US-backed Shah of Iran was overthrown. In his place rose a new political system, one built around religious leadership and resistance to Western influence. From that moment on, distrust became the foundation of US-Iran relations. Later that same year, Iranian students stormed the US embassy in Tehran and held American diplomats hostage for 444 days. That crisis did not just damage diplomacy, it reshaped public opinion in both countries. To Americans, Iran became a symbol of hostility. To many Iranians, America became a symbol of interference. And once narratives form, they are hard to undo. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the relationship remained cold and confrontational. Sanctions were imposed, accusations multiplied, proxy conflicts unfolded in neighboring countries. But the next major turning point came in the early 2000s. After the September 11 attacks in 2001, the United States expanded its military presence across the Middle East. In 2003, the US invaded Iraq, a neighbor of Iran. Suddenly, American forces were stationed on both sides of Iranian borders, Iraq to the west, Afghanistan to the east. From Tehran's perspective, this looked like encirclement. From Washington's perspective, Iran's growing regional influence looked threatening. Mutual suspicion deepened. Then came the nuclear issue. By the mid-2000s, Iran's nuclear program became the center of global debate. Western governments accused Tehran of seeking nuclear weapons capability. Iranian officials insisted their program was peaceful, focused on energy and scientific development. Years of negotiation followed. Sanctions intensified. Diplomacy stalled. In 2015, a breakthrough occurred. The Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, JCPOA, often called the Iran nuclear deal, was signed between Iran and world powers, including the United States. It limited Iran's nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. For a moment, tensions cooled, but in 2018, the United States withdrew from the agreement and reinstated heavy sanctions. Iran gradually resumed expanding parts of its nuclear program. Trust collapsed once again, and each collapse made the next agreement harder to imagine. By the 2020s, tensions were no longer confined to diplomatic rooms. There were cyber attacks, covert operations, targeted assassinations, regional proxy confrontations involving groups in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Each event added another layer to the rivalry. Each layer increased the stakes. And then came 2026, when US and Israeli intelligence assessed that Iran was nearing what they described as a dangerous nuclear threshold. They concluded that waiting was no longer an option. To them, delay meant risk. To Iran, however, foreign intervention confirmed its long-held belief that Western powers sought to weaken or destabilize the regime. So when the strikes came in February 2026, they did not emerge from nowhere. They were the climax of decades of accumulated distrust. But something about this moment was different. Previous confrontations had been limited, measured, indirect. This time, the death of Iran's supreme leader changed the equation entirely. Leadership transitions in any country create uncertainty. In a highly centralized system like Iran's, the uncertainty multiplies. Questions surfaced immediately. Who would succeed him? Would the new leadership adopt a more aggressive posture or a more pragmatic one? Would domestic pressure push Iran toward escalation or toward consolidation and caution? Internally, Iran faced a delicate balancing act. Project strength outward, maintain stability inward. A government under attack must demonstrate resilience, but it must also prevent panic, economic collapse, and fragmentation. And in the modern era, economic pressure spreads quickly. Sanctions had already strained Iran's economy for years. Inflation, currency instability, and youth unemployment created ongoing domestic challenges. War compounds these pressures. When global oil markets reacted to the conflict, energy prices surged. International shipping routes grew tense. Investors recalculated risk. In geopolitics, economic vulnerability often shapes military decision-making as much as ideology does. Meanwhile, Israel and the United States had their own strategic concerns. For Israel, the principle of preemption, acting before a threat becomes irreversible, had long guided policy. For the United States, credibility mattered. If Washington warned against certain red lines and failed to act, deterrence could weaken not just in the Middle East, but globally. So each side believed it was acting defensively. Each side believed it was responding to danger. And that is often how wars begin, not from a desire for conquest, but from competing fears. Fear of vulnerability, fear of isolation, fear of losing control. As days passed after the initial strikes, analysts began using one word repeatedly: escalation. Escalation does not always mean chaos. Sometimes it means gradual intensification, a missile for a missile, a strike for a strike, a signal for a signal. The real danger lies in miscalculation. If one side misreads the other's tolerance, if retaliation exceeds expectations, if domestic political pressure demands stronger action, history shows that wars rarely follow original plans. They evolve, they stretch, they surprise even those who start them. By early March 2026, the world stood at a crossroads. Would this confrontation remain limited, a violent but contained episode? Or would it trigger broader regional involvement? Would proxy groups enter more aggressively? Would global powers align more visibly? These were no longer academic questions. They were urgent. And in the next part, we will examine how the conflict began spreading beyond Iran and Israel into Iraq, the Gulf, and the wider international system. Because once fire starts, it rarely stays in one place. Part 3. Regional shock waves, Iraq, proxies, and the edge of expansion. When major powers clash, the impact rarely stays contained. It spreads like shock waves through water. By the third day after the February 28 strikes, the conflict between the United States and Iran was no longer just a bilateral confrontation. It had become regional, and Iraq stood directly in the middle. Iraq, the unwanted battlefield. For decades, Iraq has lived at the crossroads of American and Iranian influence. After the 2003 U.S. invasion, American troops remain present in various capacities. At the same time, Iran expanded its influence through political ties and armed groups inside Iraq. So when missiles began flying in 2026, Iraq's geography turned into liability. Several U.S. military installations inside Iraq were placed on high alert. Iranian-backed militias operating within Iraqi territory announced support for Tehran's retaliation. Some launched drone attacks. Some fired rockets. Baghdad's government publicly called for restraint, insisting it did not want its territory used as a battleground. But reality is often stronger than intention. When powerful states confront each other, middle states suffer the pressure. Iraq's leaders faced a nearly impossible equation: maintain sovereignty, avoid provoking either side, prevent domestic chaos, and protect civilians. But neutrality becomes fragile when your soil hosts foreign troops and foreign-backed militias at the same time. For ordinary Iraqis, the situation felt painfully familiar. They had seen foreign rivalries play out before, and many feared history repeating itself. The proxy question beyond Iraq, attention shifted north and west. Would Iran activate its broader network of regional allies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, armed groups in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen? For years, analysts describe this network as Iran's strategic depth, a way to project power without direct confrontation. So far, responses appeared calibrated: statements of support, limited activity, strategic messaging, but not full mobilization. Why? Because escalation carries cost for everyone. Lebanon's economy is fragile. Syria is still recovering from years of war. Even groups aligned with Iran must weigh survival against solidarity. If Hezbollah were to fully engage Israel, the conflict could transform overnight into a multi-front war, and Israel's military doctrine anticipates precisely that scenario. So deterrence works both ways. Each side signals capability, each side measures risk, each side waits. The Strait of Hormuz, a global pressure point. Meanwhile, global markets began reacting with intensity. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow waterway through which a significant portion of the world's oil passes, became a focal point of concern. If Iran were to disrupt shipping there, even temporarily, global energy markets would feel immediate impact. Oil prices surged, insurance rates for tankers increased, shipping companies recalculated routes. This is the economic dimension of war. You do not need troops crossing borders to affect the world. Sometimes fear alone moves market. In Asia, energy importing countries monitored the situation closely. In Europe, policymakers debated energy security once again. In the United States, rising fuel prices became a domestic political issue almost instantly. Modern conflict is interconnected. A missile launched in the Middle East can change grocery bills across the globe. The global alignment question. While regional actors calculated, global powers observed carefully. Russia criticized the strikes. China called for de-escalation and respect for sovereignty. European nations expressed concern over both the initial attack and the risk of retaliation, but beneath diplomatic language lies strategic positioning. Every major power asked the same silent question: if this expands, where do we stand? Open alignment can escalate conflict. Silence can shift balance. So statements were cautious, measured, deliberate, because great powers rarely rush into direct confrontation unless forced information warfare. In 2026, wars are not fought only with missiles. They are fought with narratives. Social media platforms filled with videos of explosions, intercepted rockets, grieving families, and official speeches. Some footage was verified, some was not. Governments attempted to control messaging. Opposition voices amplified alternative interpretations. In the digital era, perception shapes momentum. If one side appears dominant, morale shifts. If civilian casualties dominate headlines, international pressure intensifies. Information moves faster than diplomacy, and sometimes faster than truth. For viewers around the world, separating fact from rumor became part of daily routine. This is a new battlefield, one where influence matters as much as territory. Controlled escalation, or slipping control. By early March, analysts began using a phrase repeatedly: controlled escalation. This describes a situation where both sides retaliate, but carefully, responding without triggering full-scale war, testing limits without crossing red lines. But control depends on discipline, and discipline depends on communication. If a missile lands somewhere unexpected, if a civilian site is struck unintentionally, if a proxy group acts independently, then momentum can outrun strategy. History offers many examples of limited conflicts that expanded through miscalculation. That is the underlying fear, not intentional global war, but accidental expansion. The psychological dimension beyond strategy and economics lies something harder to measure: psychology. In Tehran, uncertainty deepened. In Tel Aviv, emergency systems remained active. In Iraq, anxiety resurfaced. In Washington, debates intensified. When populations feel threatened, political pressure grows. Leaders must respond not only to military realities, but to public expectation. Strength becomes political currency. Restraint can appear weak, and in times of crisis, perception can influence decision-making as much as intelligence reports. This psychological factor is often underestimated, but it is powerful. A region on the edge. By the end of the third major phase of this conflict, one truth became clear. The confrontation had not yet exploded into full regional war, but it had moved dangerously close. Missile exchanges remained measured, proxy involvement remained limited, diplomatic back channels reportedly remained open. These were signs that neither side desired uncontrollable escalation. But desire and outcome are not always aligned. The Middle East has long been a region where rivalries intersect. When those rivalries intensify, the margin for error shrinks. And in early March 2026, the margin felt thinner than ever. The question was no longer whether the conflict was serious. It was. The question was whether wisdom would move faster than momentum. Because once momentum takes control, history tends to accelerate. Part 4. After the leader, power, uncertainty, and the future of Iran. When a nation loses a leader suddenly, especially one who has ruled for decades, the shock is not only emotional, it is structural. The death of Iran's supreme leader was not just the removal of a political figure, it was the removal of the central pillar of Iran's system. For nearly 4 decades, he stood at the top of a unique political architecture, one that combines religious authority with political power. In Iran, the supreme leader is not symbolic. He oversees the armed forces, influences the judiciary, and shapes foreign policy direction. So when he was killed in the February 2026 strikes, the question was immediate. Who leads now? The immediate response, stability first. In the hours following confirmation of his death, Iranian officials moved quickly. National mourning was declared, public ceremonies were organized, state media emphasized unity. And perhaps most importantly, a temporary leadership council was announced to maintain continuity. This was not accidental. In moments of vulnerability, governments prioritize perception of stability, because instability invites both domestic unrest and foreign pressure. Iran's political structure includes mechanisms for succession. The Assembly of Experts, a clerical body, is responsible for appointing the next supreme leader. But while the legal process exists, politics complicates everything. Different factions within Iran hold different visions for the country's future. Some advocate a more hardline approach, stronger retaliation, deeper resistance, and expanded military posture. Others, more pragmatic voices, may see this as a moment to reduce external confrontation and prevent long-term isolation. The balance between these factions matters enormously because leadership personality shapes strategy. The power vacuum problem. In geopolitics, power vacuums are dangerous. When authority is unclear, decision-making slows. When decision-making slows, miscalculations increase. Inside Iran, security forces tightened control in major cities. Public gatherings were monitored closely. Officials emphasized national unity against foreign aggression. But behind closed doors, debates likely intensified. How aggressively should Iran respond? Should retaliation escalate or stabilize? Should diplomacy quietly reopen through intermediaries? The internal conversation may determine whether this conflict expands or contracts. History shows that leadership transitions during wartime can push countries in unpredictable directions. Some leaders seek strength to consolidate legitimacy. Others seek restraint to stabilize fragile systems. Which path Iran chooses remains uncertain. Domestic pressure. Iran's society is complex and diverse. Years of sanctions have strained the economy. Inflation has challenged households. Youth unemployment remains high. Urban populations often hold different political perspectives from rural communities. When external war combines with internal economic pressure, governments face dual stress. Project strength outward. Prevent unrest inward. Public reaction inside Iran appears mixed. Many citizens view the strike as a violation of sovereignty, a national humiliation demanding response. Others fear prolonged war could worsen economic hardship. This duality creates tension, and tension influences policy, because even authoritarian-leaning systems must consider social stability. The military factor. Another crucial variable is the role of Iran's military leadership, particularly the Revolutionary Guard. The Revolutionary Guard has long played a central role in shaping Iran's regional strategy. It manages relationships with proxy groups and oversees key missile capabilities. If military commanders adopt a more aggressive stance, escalation becomes more likely. If they favor strategic patience, the conflict may remain contained. Civilian leadership and military leadership do not always think identically. Balancing them requires coordination, and coordination requires clarity. During leadership transition, clarity can weaken. That is the risk. International perception of Iran's stability. Beyond Iran's borders, foreign governments are watching carefully. Is Iran stable? Is the government cohesive? Is there risk of internal fragmentation? Perception shapes policy. If rivals perceive weakness, they may apply pressure. If they perceive consolidation, they may proceed cautiously. The global community also watches for signs of humanitarian impact, civilian casualties, infrastructure damage, displacement. Because in modern warfare, international legitimacy matters. Even powerful states operate within a web of global opinion. Escalation or strategic pause? So far, Iran's retaliation has been forceful but measured. Missile strikes, drone deployments, strategic messaging, but not total mobilization. This suggests calculation rather than chaos. And calculation suggests that leaders, even during transition, seek controlled response. However, control can weaken under stress. If another high-profile figure is targeted, if a retaliatory strike causes mass casualties, if domestic protests erupt, then decision-making can accelerate. Momentum can overtake strategy. That is the delicate balance Iran faces. The broader implication: the death of a leader does not automatically end a system. Institutions often survive individuals, but individuals influence tone, influence pace, influence direction. The next supreme leader, whoever emerges, will inherit a country at war. That reality alone shapes their legitimacy. They must demonstrate strength, but they must also ensure survival. And survival in modern geopolitics is rarely about battlefield dominance alone. It involves economics, diplomacy, technology, narrative. If Iran stabilizes internally and manages a controlled confrontation externally, the conflict may gradually shift toward negotiation. If internal fragmentation deepens, external escalation becomes more probable. The coming weeks will be decisive. A nation at a crossroads. As the days pass, Iran stands at a historical crossroads. One path leads toward intensified regional confrontation. Another leads toward recalibration. Both paths carry risk. Both require leadership. The question is not only who leads Iran next, it is how they define strength, through expansion or through endurance. Because in war, survival itself can be a form of victory. And as the world watches Tehran's next move, one thing becomes clear. The battlefield is not only in the sky, it is also inside the halls of power. And sometimes the most important battles are invisible. Part 5. What happens next? 3 possible futures. When wars begin, the first question is always why. But after the first shock fades, a different question rises. What happens next? As of early March 2026, the US-Iran confrontation stands at a fragile intersection. Missiles have flown, leadership has changed, retaliation has begun. But the final direction of this conflict is still uncertain. History rarely moves in straight lines. Instead, it branches. And right now, 3 possible futures stand before the region and the world. Scenario 1. Controlled de-escalation. The first path is restraint. In this scenario, both sides quietly decide that the message has been delivered. The United States and Israel could declare that strategic objectives were achieved, that critical infrastructure was damaged, and deterrence was reinforced. Iran, meanwhile, could frame its retaliation as proof of resilience and strength, demonstrating that it cannot be intimidated. Each side would claim a form of victory. Behind the scenes, diplomatic channels, often invisible to the public, might become more active. Neutral mediators could facilitate indirect communication. Military exchanges would gradually decrease. The headlines would cool. Airspace would reopen. Markets would stabilize. This outcome would not mean reconciliation. It would mean recalibration, because sometimes in geopolitics, survival is victory enough. But restraint requires discipline, and discipline requires political courage. Scenario 2, prolonged shadow conflict. The second path is slower and perhaps more likely, a prolonged, low-intensity confrontation. In this scenario, neither side fully escalates, but neither side fully retreats. Missile exchanges continue intermittently. Cyber attacks intensify. Proxy groups increase limited operations. Naval patrols grow more aggressive. Diplomatic hostility remains high. This type of conflict does not dominate headlines every day, but it quietly reshapes the region. It drains resources. It shifts alliances. It keeps populations anxious. Over time, it can become the new normal. History shows that rivalries sustained at medium intensity can last years, even decades, and sometimes these shadow conflicts are more destabilizing in the long term than short wars, because they normalize tension, they embed distrust, they redefine what peace looks like. Scenario 3, regional expansion. The third path is the most dangerous. Regional expansion. If major proxy forces fully engage, if missile exchanges widen dramatically, if another high-profile leader or facility is targeted, momentum could outrun caution. In this scenario, the conflict spreads beyond initial actors. Lebanon could ignite. Syria could destabilize further. The Strait of Hormuz could become militarized. Global energy markets would convulse. Superpowers might become more visibly involved. This is the scenario that policymakers fear most, not because it is inevitable, but because it can emerge from miscalculation rather than intention. History has shown again and again that wars often expand not because leaders plan them to, but because signals are misread. A retaliatory strike that goes too far, a missile that lands in the wrong place, a domestic political speech that leaves no room for compromise. Escalation sometimes grows from pride as much as strategy. The global implications. Beyond regional dynamics, this confrontation carries long-term consequences. First, deterrence has been redefined. The precedent of directly targeting top leadership, whether confirmed or reported, changes calculations everywhere. Governments around the world are watching closely. Second, alliances are being tested. Nations must decide how openly to support, condemn, or distance themselves from the confrontation. These decisions shape future cooperation economically and militarily. Third, global energy security remains vulnerable. Even limited instability in key transit routes can ripple across continents. Fourth, the role of technology drones, cyber capabilities, precision strikes continues to transform warfare. Modern conflict is faster, more interconnected, and less predictable than ever before. This is not simply a regional war. It is a case study in 21st century geopolitics. Power, fear, and human cost. At its core, this confrontation reflects two forces that drive much of international politics: power and fear. Nations seek power to protect themselves, but when one nation increases its power, others feel fear. Fear leads to reaction. Reaction leads to escalation. Breaking this cycle requires trust. and trust is fragile, especially after violence. But beyond power and fear lies something more human. Civilians, families in Tehran listening for distant echoes, families in Tel Aviv checking emergency alerts, soldiers stationed far from home calculating risk, Iraqis hoping their land does not once again become a battleground for others. Behind every geopolitical analysis is a human story, and human stories do not fit neatly into strategic framework. A turning point. So is this moment a turning point? Possibly. Moments like this rarely disappear without consequence. Even if the missiles slow, even if diplomacy resumes, the psychological impact remains. Generations remember when the sky changed. Markets remember volatility. Governments remember vulnerability. And policymakers adjust future doctrine accordingly. Sometimes the true impact of a conflict is not measured in territory gained or lost. It is measured in how future leaders think, how they calculate risk, how quickly they act, how cautiously they hesitate. The events of early 2026 will likely shape regional strategy for years to come. The final question, as this chapter continues to unfold, the world waits, not for more explosions, but for clarity. Will wisdom outrun momentum? Will diplomacy catch up with retaliation? Will strength be defined by escalation or by restraint? History often rewards those who can step back at the right moment. But stepping back requires confidence, and confidence requires stability. The US-Iran confrontation stands on that thin line, and tonight, as headlines scroll and analysts debate, the future remains unwritten, because war begins with action. But its ending depends on choice, and in the end, the most powerful decision in any conflict is the decision to stop. The headlines may change tomorrow, the tension may rise or slowly fade, but moments like this leave a mark on history. The US-Iran confrontation is more than a political event. It is a reminder of how quickly the world can shift and how deeply global events affect ordinary lives. If this episode helped you understand the conflict while improving your English at the same time, don't forget to subscribe to the English Oasis. Here, we turn global headlines into meaningful learning journeys. Stay informed, stay thoughtful, and I'll see you in the next story.